Getting close. Go ahead and hit share screen a little early. Go. Getting close. Oh, mute my echo view. That happened. Shrink it down. And then get the text centered again. Okay. Lovely. All right. And it's only 12:01. Not too bad at all. Give it just one more second for those who are trying to log in. I know these things take time. All right, well, I don't want to leave it too late, so let's go ahead and get down to work. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next Torah study. In this case, we are in Parashat Beshallach. This is most famous for the crossing of the sea, but for the eagle-eyed of you, you'll notice that we are on chapter 16, which is after the parting, and when real life hits. And real life comes with some difficult questions. And, and so we will have to look at some of them and see the response from the people and look in more depth at exactly what God's response to the people's response is trying to teach not only them, but to also teach us. As always, though, we need to start off with a little bit of text in order that we can actually ground ourselves in the Torah. So let's go ahead and begin. We are in chapter 16, beginning with verse 1. They marched on from Elim, and they came, the entire community of the children of Israel, till the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their going out from the land of Egypt. This is one of the many contextual clues where we begin to see the travel time, which leads us to understand the relationship between Pesach and the holiday of Shavuot 50 days later, but that's not the focus for today. And they grumbled, the entire community of the children of Israel, against Moshe and against Aharon in the wilderness. Real life, here we go again. So we'd already had a little grumbling at the edge of the sea before the water had split. We'd had a little grumbling about water itself, meaning potable drinking water, and now we are getting more grumbling. So let's see what the focus is of the grumbling for this event. Verse 3. The children of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of Adonai in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots, when we ate bread till we were satisfied," implied, for you have brought us into this wilderness to bring death to this whole assembly by starvation. Yes. Now, before we get too harsh on it, because it's very easy in hindsight to see how silly this is. Obviously, at the time, it was incredibly difficult. And for most of us, would we have understanding and patience of a difficult situation when it looked, according to all the normal rules that the world was governed by, that there was no hope to feed this many thousands of people? I think most of us would be equally panicked. Maybe we wouldn't quite remember Egypt so fondly, but certainly the idea here is that Egypt may have been bad, but at least there was food. And now there is not. And that is a fundamental truth, that the Egyptians made sure that of the slaves they allowed to live, after having killed so many, that they did keep them fed, because after all, they needed us to do work. And if you are now facing starvation, it is natural to imagine that starvation is worse than slavery. And therefore, it would have been better if we were just going to die to at least kill us in a place where we had food. I'd rather die on a full stomach than die of starvation. And this is generally borne out, as we've talked about in other classes, with the idea that starvation is absolutely one of the worst types of deaths imaginable. All right, so the people are hungry, or at least they are concerned about being hungry. Adonai said to Moshe, "Here, I will make rain down upon you bread from the heavens. For the people shall go out and glean each day's amount in its day, in order that I may test them, whether they will walk according to my instruction or not. But it shall be on the sixth day, when they prepare what they have brought in, it shall be a double portion compared to what they glean day after day," meaning each normal day of the week. So here we get a little microcosm of Shabbat. There will be a double portion on the sixth day, and thus we will have enough for Shabbat because nothing will be brought then. And this bread from heaven, of course, becomes known as manna a little bit later on in the chapter, but we'll call it that for the time being because it's easier. This bread for heaven is going to be what will sustain them in the wilderness. And there is a test built into it. Here, at least according to the Peshat, being this test regarding Shabbat, about how we will get this double portion. And of course, we will not be collecting anything on Shabbat itself. As a little halacha l'maaseh, this is one of the reasons for the tradition of having double loaves, of having 2 loaves of challah for our Shabbat meal, to remind ourselves of the double portion of manna that God gave us in the wilderness. On to verse 6. Moshe and Aharon said to all the children of Israel, "At sunset you will know that it is Adonai who brought you out of the land of Egypt. At daybreak you will see the glory of Adonai, when he hearkens to your grumblings against Adonai. And what are we that you grumble against us?" So there's a lot going on in these couple sentences, and the grammar is not exactly, hold on a second, I want to put these both on the screen at once. And the grammar is not exactly crystal clear in either language of exactly which clause is modifying which, or at least it might be clear to different commentators, but each one of them has it in a different way. So that means we have to admit that it is not perfectly clear, or there would be unanimous agreement. So what's going on here? Well, it seems that Moses and Aaron are conveying God's message with a little explanatory note, that there is going to be something at sunset that will trigger the knowledge, the understanding. Remember, knowledge is deeper than simply an awareness of a fact, but a true imbibing of the importance of it, that it is Adonai who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, is this telling us what's going to happen with the food? Is this telling us that because of the way the food happens, that we will come to understand God? Or is this, in particular, taking issue with the fact that the people had said, "Moses and Aaron, why did you bring us out to the wilderness?" When, of course, Moses and Aaron may have been walking up front, but they were not the instrument. They were not the actual power behind the Exodus. They were just there as part of God's envoy. So this may be emphasizing that we will become aware that it was God who brought us out of the land of Egypt, not Moses and Aaron. So there are a number of different ways to read this, and we will be looking at a couple ways of handling this when we get into our commentary. But of course, verse 7 then gives us the parallel that at daybreak we will see the glory of God, Kivod Adonai. Now, Kivod Adonai, the glory of God, is a beautiful and powerful term that is used in many different ways in many different places. So we are going to have to break it down to see exactly what is meant by the glory of God in this context. And we're also going to have to see why the extra reminder that what is taking place is going to be in relationship to the grumbling. Is this a good vision of God's glory? Is this a negative vision? And of course, then the final human element, Moses and Aaron recognizing that the grumbling is being directed at them when it is, of course, God that is ultimately responsible for all that is going on. But the people still seem to miss that understanding, which is perfectly fair. If you had been raised in Egypt, where Pharaoh called himself the God King, you probably would have focused on the human standing in the front rather than God as well. All right, so let's see what actually happens. Oh, come on, there we go. And Moshe said, when Adonai gives you meat to eat at sunset, and at daybreak bread to satisfy yourselves, when Adonai hearkens to your grumblings, which you grumble against him, and what are we? Not against us are your grumblings, but against Adonai. So we get a little more detail that the meat is going to come at sunset, and that in the daybreak it will be bread. Now, the bread we've already heard about. That is what we refer to as manna, or man in the Hebrew. But what is this meat that is being introduced here in the conversation? And why is one coming at sunset and why is one coming in the morning? Well, why not being served together? And of course, a re-emphasis on the grumbling here leads us to believe that whatever is taking place, it's not entirely with God's great happiness, that God is a little miffed at things that are being done. On to verse 9. Moshe said to Aharon, say to the entire community of the children of Israel, come near in the presence of Adonai, for he has hearkened to your grumblings, meaning God's going to respond. Now it was when Aaron spoke to the entire community of the children of Israel that they faced the wilderness, and here the glory of Adonai could be seen in the cloud. Aha, we think. Here is the glory of God, the one that was mentioned just a while ago, and we know that there was this cloud that was with the people, guiding them through their travels. So that must be the point, right? It's not exactly exceptional. After all, the cloud is always there, or a pillar of fire at night. So it doesn't immediately show how this could be relevant to the grumblings and relevant to the particular issue of hunger and of what they are eating. So we will continue on. And Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, I have hearkened to the grumblings of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, between the setting times you shall eat meat, and at daybreak you shall be satisfied with bread, and you shall know that I am Adonai your God. Now it was at sunset, a horde of quail came up and covered the camp, and at daybreak there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew went up, now here upon the surface of the wilderness, something fine, scaly, fine as hoarfrost upon the land. This is our manna, but you'll notice that we snuck in a flock of quail that provided the meat that had been discussed earlier on. So the man gets all the attention, but the quail is also a major part of this particular episode. Quail, of course, also come up in the book of Numbers in Bamidbar. So we're going to have to unpack why both. Was there a different idea behind each? These are things that we will take a look at. The children of Israel saw it, and they said, each one to his brother, Manhu, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moshe said to them, it is the bread that Adonai has given you for eating. All right, so we finally get the name man, or manna, as we say in English, and everything seems okay. Well, but what about the grumbling? We kept building up. Oh, you're grumbling. Oh, you're grumbling. You're grumbling. Oh, you're grumbling. Well, fine. Have some quail and bread, or man. Where's the reprimand? I mean, we got implicit reprimands. They're grumbling against me, but it seems like the people got what they wanted. It feels like we were building towards something, and then what we got wasn't quite what was expected. I mean, obviously the manna was completely new, which is why they're asking themselves, what is this? But it also feels emotionally that we took a turn. As we'll see in the commentary, definitely not. A lot happened here in the subtext that a casual reading will miss, but thankfully we have many commentators that do not engage in casual readings because the Torah is far too important to read it with one eye tied behind our back. Before we jump into those commentaries, I always like to leave a little break to see if anyone has any lingering questions on the text before we get into our specific reflections. Not seeing anyone unmuting on Zoom, and looks like no one on YouTube either, so let's go ahead and dive in. So we're going to begin with a selection from Shulchan Aruch. As many of you know, if you are familiar with the standard practices of Jewish prayer, before we actually get into our obligatory tefillah, before we get into the main sections of the Amidah, Shema and its blessings, etc., there are many preliminary reflections. Birkot HaShachar, Pesukei Zimra are the two categories, and in them, according to tradition, there are some recommended passages to read. Now, as you can see, it is good, meaning that it is not 100% obligatory, but it is good to read from these different passages. Now, these should be fairly clear. The binding, what we call the Akedah, which is Genesis 22, 1 to 19, the passage of the manna, which is what we are reading right now, the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, seems fairly self-explanatory, and the passages of the burnt offering, the tribute offering, peace offering, and sin offerings from their various places, and the guilt offering from the various places in the book of Leviticus. Now, those last ones may seem a little curious, but remember that according to the sages, to reflect upon an offering is the same as actually performing the offering. After all, it is the feelings of our heart, the words of our lips that are superior to the actual sacrifices, and without which the sacrifices would be meaningless themselves. And since the temple has been destroyed, we reflect on these offerings as a way of performing the same spiritual service without the physical element. So, reminding ourselves of the Akedah, the great connection between us and God that was exemplified through the near sacrifice of Isaac, the Ten Commandments, and the offerings all make perfect sense. But manna? Why are we reading about manna daily? This seems like an odd choice. It doesn't really fit. I mean, the rest makes a lot of sense. However, I will point out, because this often is queried, the Ramah, the Ashkenazi voice within Shulchan Aruch, points out, but only in private is it permissible to recite the Ten Commandments each day. It is forbidden to recite them in congregation. Now that probably sounds very weird, and it is a historical artifact. In the different segments of our time, of our life, of our nation, there have been other groups that have borrowed our Bible, and many of them have claimed that only the Ten Commandments were the real commandments. Only the Ten Commandments were actually binding or were still binding. And that set the Ten Commandments up as though, as long as we focused on them, the others were of no significance. Obviously, Judaism does not agree with that, and it became public policy to de-emphasize the public reading of the Ten Commandments so that they could not be, we would not accidentally come to think of them as being more important than the other commandments. I know that seems a little back to front, but we have had to adapt our own practice because of the maladaption of others for our text. And this is one of the things you do when you are in a minority situation, but you are trying to remain true to your faith. All right, so we have the manna passage here, which really does seem out of place. Well, let's look at one explanation for why it might not be so unusual to recite this each morning. We also find that the Holy One tests the wealthy and the poor. He tests the wealthy one. Will he behave properly with his wealth that God has given him? Does he give much charity, tzedakah, or not? He tests the poor one if he will not speak against God, meaning will he rail against God for allowing him to be poor? The Holy One similarly tests the soul, which comes into the body. Will the soul follow the body and the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, or will the soul only follow Torah and commandments, the good inclination? In a sense, what Tze'ena Ura'ena is trying to say is that the man was a test not just of will we follow Shabbat, gather on 6 days, not gather on the seventh, but that through this bringing in of the food, being supported by God in this way, being satisfied in this way, we also have a template for some of the other tests that will happen within our own spirit, whether we will respond well in a good, powerful, and meaningful way? Should we be rich or should we be poor? That our connection, our belief, and our fulfillment of God's word is not contingent upon our bank account, but is instead contingent upon us. Similarly, our soul. Will our soul be the dominant force within our lives, or will we follow our bodily cravings and lead us into ruin? And this, of course, is something that is easily seen with regards to the question of food. How will we respond when it comes time to satisfy that instinct, that need for nourishment? Will we follow Torah and commandments and thus enrich our soul as well as feed our body? Or will we focus primarily on our gut and just eat regardless of Torah, of commandments, or anything else? These are choices. So the story of the manna, say many commentators, is a story that helps us in each day's reflection to focus on how will I meet the tests of today? How will I meet the test of wealth? How will I meet the test of poverty? How will I meet the test of my soul versus my body? And these are reflections that are worthy and are helpful each day to make, because after all, each day, apart from Shabbat, when we don't read that selection usually, is a day of work, is a day of going out into the world. And how will we focus our thoughts? And the man is a wonderful episode for getting us in that right frame of mind. However, it doesn't quite answer all the questions that we had about the story of the manna. It didn't answer exactly, how is this proof? What do we mean by God's glory? How is this morning and evening thing working out? Why meat and bread? All of those questions are still a little bit loose. And while there are many commentaries, and I always recommend that you go read them as well, Ramban gives an extended explanation, which covers a little bit of Rashi and some of the other rabbinic teachings, but puts it into a framework that is a little bit grander. And as such, we will take an extended excursion into his teaching. At even, meaning the evening, then you shall know that the Eternal brought you out from the land of Egypt, which is what we saw. And in the morning, then you will see the glory of the Eternal. This does not refer to God's glory that appeared in the cloud, verse 10, for that occurred later when Aaron spoke to them, and they looked towards the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Eternal appeared in the cloud. All right, so first of all, he just wants to clarify that when we're talking about that verse 10 incident of God's glory, that is not the glory that was being promised to be witnessed with the coming of the morning. Because after all, the glory that was seen in the cloud happened prior to the morning when the other glory was going to be witnessed. As such, they can't be the same glory. It's the trouble with having a common term like kavod that is going to crop up more than once. So, yes, there was glory of God in the cloud, but that is different than the message that was coming from the morning appearance. And that we need to continue to unravel then. So, Ramban quotes Rashi, as saying, but, commented Rashi, thus did Moses say to them, at even then you shall know that his hand has the power to give you your desire, and he will give you flesh. All right, so that evening time, what is that connected to? It's connected to the meat, to the flesh of the quail. So we will then know that it is God that brought us out of the land of Egypt, because we will receive something that we would have thought was beyond the power to give. Remember, the underlying concern in the grumbling is not just food. It's that even if we currently have food, what are we going to eat out there? I mean, this is the bigger long-term issue. Whatever we brought with us from Egypt is either gone or rapidly dwindling. And while we may have livestock, which you could fault us for not eating, livestock are irreplaceable. And when we eat them, it is permanently gone. It's like eating from the principal rather than from the interest. So it is reasonable to think, says Rashi, that the knowledge that is coming from this is by fulfilling that desire for meat in a way that could not be explained as a simple act. However, He will not, however, give it to you with a bright countenance, meaning in a happy mode, since you were improper in asking for it, inasmuch as one can exist without meat. Besides, you asked for it on a full stomach, that is, while still having cattle, which you took along with you from Egypt. So there is a little bit of a negative twist that it came in the evening, specifically to mean that it will be a dark fulfillment. Yes, you'll get what you want, but I can understand that what you were asking for was inappropriate because you could have lived without it, and you already had meat should you really desire it that much. But I will bring it anyway to bring it clear, to make it clear to you that I am God, and I am the power that took you out of Egypt. But as regards the bread, which you properly asked out of necessity, when it falls in the morning, you will see the glory of his countenance, as he will bring it down for you in a manner indicative of love. That is, in the morning, while there is yet time to prepare it. The quail, on the other hand, came down at even in the evening, when there was not much time to prepare it. So Rashi, as quoted by Ramban here, is saying, look, we got the quail at an inconvenient time. They all piled up in the evening, and there wasn't much time to get things ready, so we just sort of ate what we could, and that was it. And it might have been good, but it wasn't as good as it could have been. The man, on the other hand, came in the morning, and becoming in the morning, it gave us lots of time to prepare it to our own satisfaction and liking, and that showed that God was happier with the question of about bread than he was of the question for meat. So Rashi's answer, fairly straightforward, based on some rabbinic teaching, as we'll see Ramban go into in more detail. But Ramban is not satisfied. He also has a long diversion into Ibn Ezra's teaching, but I'm afraid we are not going to have time for that. But go look up the full commentary if you're interested. And Ramban continues, but it is not correct to interpret the expression what glory of the eternal is made manifest in this. Right? This is not the correct interpretation. We need to understand this glory here as being something other than he sent the meat at an inconvenient time and he sent the man at a good time. And this midrash of our rabbis, the one that Rashi was basing off of, is not a comment upon the expression, then you shall see the glory of the eternal, meaning that when we see commentary from the rabbis of old or from the Middle Ages, we always have to work out what exactly were they referring to. Even when they quote a whole verse, which part of the verse are they unpacking? Are they trying to clarify? It's like when someone says, are you going to the party? I could emphasize, are you going to the party? Are you going to the party? You're going to the party? And my commentary might give an emphasis of the party really seems inappropriate right now. Thus, we know you're emphasizing the word party. In text, of course, it's not apparent. Inflection, I can show you which part of the sentence I'm talking about. Sometimes in text, I can make it explicit, but sometimes we have to interpret the interpretation. And Ramban is saying that Rashi got his interpretation of the rabbi's interpretation wrong, that they were not focusing on the main topic of the glory of God the way that Rashi thought. Instead, the rabbis, all the way back in the Midrash, the rabbi said it, that he apportioned their sustenance twice a day and did not distribute all of it in the morning. Thus, the rabbis in the Mechilta, the Midrash collection, and Moses said, this shall be when the Eternal shall give you in the evening flesh to eat and in the morning bread to full. From here you learn that he gave them the quail with a dark countenance. The manna, however, which they were justified in requesting, he gave them with a bright countenance, that is to say, in the morning. So Ramban agrees with the sages of the Mechilta that the quail came at an inconvenient time and that the manna came at a good time, but that is not explaining the glory part, the kavod of God. That is simply explaining why one came at which point and why it was not all distributed at the same time. So it is doing a job of interpretation, but it's not answering what, for Ramban, is the central question of how does the morning help us reflect on the glory of God? not the entire selection of evening and morning, and that's telling us about the glory of God. But specifically, the language of the text is saying it's the morning experience that will tell us about the glory of God. And that has yet to be answered if we were to follow Rashi's interpretation of this midrash. All right, hopefully I didn't lose everyone there with 3 layers of interpretation. Ramban talking about Rashi, talking about the sages of the Mechilta, talking about the Torah. Hopefully that is clear. If not, pause it, rewind, go through it again, or as always, approach me directly in any way that's convenient for you. Okay, so now having told us that Rashi is wrong, Ramban will, thankfully, tell us what he thinks to be the right explanation. The correct interpretation appears to me to be that the wonder inherent in the manna was extremely great, whereas he brought the quail in from the sea by a wind which came from him. In Numbers 11, where we have a second episode of quail, it is said that they are blown in by a wind. And in the minimum at the moment, Ramban is saying, look, the manna seems to be special, whereas the quail was just blown off course. And that seems to be a reduction in the magnificence of the miracle. So therefore, the manna is more special. The manna, however, was created for them now, a new creation in heaven, similar to the process of the original creation, Maaseh Bereshit. All right, so Ramban, at a minimum, is saying that the manna is telling us more about God's glory because it took more to make it. This was not redirecting some birds. This was an actual novel creation, and creation is an incredibly amazing, powerful, and in the ultimate reality of sense of things, something uniquely fitted to God. We can catch a whole bunch of quail. We can't create manna. Therefore, the manna had a special revelatory effect that was separate from the experience of the quail. That's why they are in 2 different categories. We know God through the quail, but we see the glory of God because of the manna. Now, we could stop there, and many commentators do and will. However, Ramban is nothing if not thorough. This is the intent of what the rabbis have said with respect to the manna, that it was created on the 6th day of creation between sundown and nightfall. So in Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, there is a beautiful set of teachings about the end of creation, where the sages try to outline some of the things that occur throughout the biblical period, or a few other things by logic that must exist, that don't seem to fit neatly into the pattern of reality. They don't seem to follow the normal rules of creation. They are aberrations. So how do they reconcile that? They say they were made as the final last tidbits of creation that waited in a holding pattern before they inserted themselves into reality at their appointed times. So therefore, the manna is a creation, but it wasn't created at that moment per se. It was created at the beginning of time, at the beginning of all of creation. It was already planned and coded into the fabric of reality, and now it is coming out. This is why Scripture said, by the sign he will perform for you on the coming night, you will know that he brought you out from the land of Egypt, since he prepared a table in the wilderness for you. Right? This is a huge, huge example of God being God in the most powerful, the most glorious way. But by the great wonder he will do for you in the morning, the manna, you will see the glory of his kingdom. For what God is there in heaven or on earth that can do according to his works and according to his mighty acts? Reference to Deuteronomy. By the great and marvelous things that God does, he shows his glory, similar to that which is written, I will gather all nations and all tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. It is further written there, in Isaiah, continued, and they shall declare my glory. And there are many other verses similar to this effect. And of course, he brings many more proofs as well. So the manna reflects God's glory because it is an essential reflection of creation itself. As such, this is not just the story of Poseidon making a wave that pushes Ulysses off course. This is creation made manifest in a way that is completely new and novel for the people in the wilderness to experience. And that is the glory that is being reflected here. But we're not done, because Ramban wants us to understand that because of the nature of manna, there is even more that we can learn from it and more that we can take to heart. And going back to our reflections about our morning readings, an even deeper reason why we might continue to read the story of the manna long after we are done eating it. Know that the subject of manna involves a great matter. This is usually code in Ramban for trying to teach us something of a more mystical or spiritual or deeper understanding that is difficult for the mind to grasp. That it is something that we could easily make a mistake upon in our understanding, and something that we usually make mistakes in not understanding the first time through. I'll try to walk us through it. As always, if you have questions now, unmute if you're on Zoom, type it up in the chat box on YouTube, and if you have questions later, contact me directly. This is not something that will come too easily, but it is very worthwhile to reflect on. So let's dive in and try it together. Our rabbis have alluded to it in Tractate Yoma, this great matter. Man did eat bread of Abirim, the mighty. So that's a quote taken from Psalm 78. That is to say, who are the mighty? This is the bread which the ministering angels eat. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. So when Rabbi Akiva reads the Psalm 78, and it comes and says, we, humanity, ate bread of the mighty, Rabbi Akiva says, we ate the same food that the angels eat. Rabbi Ishmael doesn't agree. Rabbi Ishmael said to him, you have made a mistake. Do ministering angels need to eat bread? Has it not been said by Moses in Deuteronomy, I did neither eat bread nor drink water when he was up on Mount Sinai? And if a human didn't eat bread or drink water, then all the more so angels wouldn't be eating or drinking in God's realm. Rather, the bread of Abirim means bread absorbed in their evarim, in their limbs. That there is a embodying process when we are eating this, that there's a certain type of bread that makes us feel mighty, that gives us strength, that you could say bulks us up in some way. So Rabbi Ishmael is taking this to be a much more mundane. Rabbi Akiva is saying, no, this is literally eating the food of heaven. And that is obviously setting Rabbi Ishmael off, because things in heaven don't eat. Okay, now we need to reconcile this, and Ramban is going to try and help us here. The purport of Rabbi Akiva's words, what he's trying to say, is that the existence of the ministering angels is sustained by the divine glory, by the kavod of God. And so the rabbis interpreted in Shemot Rabbah, a different midrash, and you mechaye them all, you preserve them all. This is a quote taken from Nehemiah, meaning he gives food, michya, to you all. Now, what does that mean? With reference to this, it is said, and the light is sweet, from Ecclesiastes. Well, light is sweet means light has flavor, and flavor is food, and you preserve them all, since through the light they perceive good discernment. So what Ramban is trying to do with the rabbinic interpretation here is say that the light of God is a sweetness that fulfills, that sustains everything. And of course, in this particular case, we are talking about the angelic host as well. The forces at God's disposal are sustained by the light of God. Now, the manna was a product of that higher light, which became tangible by the will of its creator, blessed be he, and thus, according to Rabbi Akiva, both the people who ate the manna and the ministering angels were sustained by the same substance. So Akiva, says Ramban, didn't think that the angels were munching on manna biscuits. He didn't think that they were having um, a sit-down meal with manna on the plate, but instead that the manna was a solidified version of God's light from the highest level of heaven. And thus we were eating something which came from the same flow as the energy that sustains the angels. Now, ironically, in some scientific ways, this is actually very, very true. After all, when we look up at the stars, sometimes we will reflect on that as being the heavenly host, although certainly not, they are not divinity, but these stars are sustained by the light, the reaction that happens deep inside their core. And we, when we eat even regular bread, we are eating from that same energy source that lands on our planet as solar light and which makes plants grow, which we then turn eat. So we are eating starlight just as much as the stars are sustained by the energy process which creates that starlight deep within their core in the whole fusion process. So I'm not saying that Rabbi Akiva was talking specifically about interstellar matters, but it is a way for us in the modern world with different cosmology to try and contextualize what's going on here. That the ultimate fabric of the world is sustained by God's light, and we ate that fabric, we ate that light through manna at the time. Now, Rabbi Ishmael still disagrees. Rabbi Ishmael criticized him, since the existing of the ministering angels is not dependent upon something tangible evolving for light. Their existence is by means of the higher light itself. Rabbi Ishmael wasn't necessarily disagreeing about the nature of manna, but he wanted to make it absolutely clear angels don't eat physical substances because angels themselves are not physical. And that is a very important point. It's something that gets lost far too often in other theologies and casual superstition. And so between Akiva and Ishmael, with Ramban's reconciliation, we are getting the best of both worlds, if you will. Now, why is this important? It is for this reason, the heavenly origin of manna, that the Israelites found in the manna every flavor they desired. The rational power of the soul, part of us that is truly heavenly, causes it to cleave to the higher worlds, which it comes, thus finding restful life and obtaining his favor, meaning God. Scripture is alluding, according to the words of Rabbi Elazar Chizma, that those inheriting eternal life in the world to come will exist by the substance of the manna, which is the higher glory. Just as the rabbis have said, now back in the Talmud, in the world to come, there will be neither eating nor drinking. Rather, the righteous will sit with their crowns on their heads and enjoy the divine glory. Thus, the verses allude to the manner in which the righteous inheriting the world to come will be sustained, the hint being to the substance of the manna. All right, so it's a long road from grumbling about what we're going to eat to getting quail and manna to seeing in a distinction between them the glory of God being reflected in the manna specifically, and seeing that this is lechem min hashamayim, that this is bread coming from heaven, as having a specific quote of being the glory of God, to help us understand that it comes from that higher light being made manifest in a tangible way that allows us to then not only understand the amazing opportunity that our ancestors had, but to understand that that is the ultimate sustenance for our souls, not just in this world, but in the world to come. That ultimately it is that light of God that is truly what keeps us going. And that is where we will look for our hope and look for our true sustenance, if you will. And all of that comes from the slight wording of there'll be evening, and then and you'll know God, and then in the morning, and you'll see the glory. According to Ramban and many others, he's not alone in these interpretations. He's just the most extensive in his analysis. That this is where we can truly see that that deeper understanding of what was going on. Surely that is then very worthwhile to read daily, to remind ourselves of this, that we are being truly sustained by God's light, not just by the handful of food that we eat each day, and that ultimately our purpose in this world is guided by that glory, by that light, more than it is by our darker appetites, which we're hankering after the meat, which, yes, we get, but that is also partly the test. Are we going to focus entirely on what's on the menu, or are we going to look for the true substance of the world, the true substance of our own soul? Because our soul wants to be connected to that higher world. We just keep getting a little confused in the process. All right, we will leave it there for today, unless there are any other questions or comments. And I will see you next week as we continue our journey out of Egypt, through the wilderness, and on into our next adventure. Take care, everyone. Be well, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.